Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on New York's climate and renewable energy mandates. We're so excited to have you all here, and we're so grateful to have such a fantastic panel of experts lined up today. My name is Lynda Nguyen. I am an associate at the Climate Jobs Institute and your moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin, I want to tackle some housekeeping items. So first, we are recording the webinar and we'll have it available for you afterwards. So keep a lookout for an email. We will also be doing a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So please use the Q&A box at the screen, below the screen to submit your questions. Okay, so with that, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the Climate Jobs Institute. CJI was formally established within Cornell University's Industrial and Labor Relations School in 2023. The Institute was built upon a large body of work spanning more than a decade by our executive director, Dr. Lara Skinner. Our mission is to guide New York's and the nation's transition to a strong and equitable clean energy economy that tackles the climate crisis, confronts race and gender inequality, and builds a diverse and unionized clean energy workforce. As part of that mission, today CJI is launching a report titled New York's Renewable Energy Policies, Plans and Progress, a Climate Jobs Perspective. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda for this afternoon. First, we'll start with a brief overview of CJI's findings. We'll then go into a panel discussion, and we'll conclude with some Q&A from the audience. With that, I'd like to introduce Bethany Figueroa, Research Support Specialist, and Iris Packman, Senior Policy and Research Associate, both from the Climate Jobs Institute. They are the co-authors of the report we're launching today and will lead us in a brief presentation. Iris and Bethany, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lynda. We're really excited to share our research with everyone. As Lynda said, I'm Iris Packman. I am a research and policy development faculty at CJI and a labor lawyer by training. My focus is on how we create high-quality union jobs in the transition to clean energy. Bethany, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Iris. Hi, I'm Bethany Figueroa, a Research Support Specialist at the Climate Jobs Institute. I'm a co-author on this report. I have a background in chemical engineering, and I currently analyze clean energy technologies and policy targets in our reports.
Thank you so much. So just to give you a little overview of why we're here and what we were researching, we wanted to understand where New York has come so far. It's 2025, and a lot of the key goals are coming up in 2030. And we wanted to reflect back on what has been done and how close we are to achieving various targets that have been set. So in 2019, New York passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to address the rise in greenhouse gas emissions and the associated impacts. And here we're hoping to see carbon neutrality by 2050. This is in alignment with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment that this is what is needed to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we are already seeing climate impacts in the state. It's an urgent threat to our local communities. And we're seeing that New York is actually warming faster than the national average. Next slide, please. This means more severe weather and climate events. In measuring the impact of these events, one metric is how many climate events cost the state at least $1 billion. In the past decade, New York has experienced more than 45 climate disasters that cost at least $1 billion. This is nearly the same amount as the past 3 decades combined. So it was 45 events in the past decade, 47 in the prior 3 decades combined. We're also falling behind in our renewable energy goals. We have a goal of 70% renewable electricity by 2030. It looks like from our assessment, optimistically, we'll be at more like 44% renewables by 2030. And then in terms of the emissions, the state is likely to exceed the current mandated levels. The target under the CLCPA is dropping 40% below the 1990 levels by 2030, which is less than 5 years from now, 85% by 2050. So far, the latest data we have is that the drop in 2022 was 9.4% below 1990 levels. So again, we're trying to get to 40% in less than 5 years from now. And so this is really essential to cut the emissions to accomplish these reductions to avoid the worst impacts. We're seeing increased flooding, heavy precipitation, extreme heat, poor air quality, wildfires, hurricanes, just many impacts on the state. Next slide, please. Specifically looking at the emissions target, this chart shows you the 1990 levels, the latest data, the 2022, which shows a 9.4% reduction, and then our target by 2030, which is a 40% reduction. We're seeing very little progress. We still have a long way to go. And to achieve this, New York is going to have to switch to more renewable forms of electricity to decarbonize buildings and transportation. Buildings represented nearly a third of the state's emissions, 31% in 2022, followed by transportation at about 26% and electricity at 17% of the state's emissions. So despite electricity contributing only 1/3 approximately of the state's emissions, it is essential to decarbonize the transportation and building sectors. We have to electrify them. So we must look at upgrading the grid in order to achieve this reduction and meeting the growing demand for electricity. Next slide, please. So looking at our clean energy goals specifically, the goal here for 2030 is that we will be at 70% of electricity as renewable. Now, unfortunately, based on our calculations, most optimistically would be about 44% renewable by 2030. And most likely the earliest we could achieve that 70% target would be 2035, another 5 years off the target. This is potentially pushed back even further depending on where we see actions on the federal offshore wind projects and higher than expected energy demands that could further push it beyond 2035. And to achieve this, the state will need to accelerate the build out of solar, wind, both onshore and offshore wind, energy storage, and transmission. Next slide, please. So some of the targets specifically set out as state law, we have a 6 gigawatt goal for energy storage. Currently, we're at about 1/4 of that goal. And again, we have less than 5 years to achieve that. By 2030, the state is hoping to have 6 gigawatts of energy storage. This will, even if we meet the 6 gigawatts, that would only support about 18% of the state's peak demand. Looking at our solar goals, so the state has a goal of distributed solar, which is the smaller scale, less than 1 megawatt, rooftop, that kind of solar would be 6 gigawatts by 2025. And we did achieve that just at the end of 2024. And it looks like we're on track to meet the 10 gigawatt by 2030 goal, again, for distributed solar. But this overall, to put it in perspective, would still fulfill less than 5% of the state's present electricity use, would power about 1 million homes. And so that, is a small amount of what we actually need for the whole state to electrify. The offshore wind goal is 9 gigawatts by 2035. This would produce about as much electricity as 20% of today's grid. But this will probably be smaller by 2035 because of rising electrification. Most likely that would only fulfill by then about 14% of the state's energy needs. Recent federal actions through executive order and Department of Interior have paused New York's projects, jeopardizing the 1.7 gigawatts that's already been planned. And so we are very unlikely to see the 9 gigawatt by 2035 goal be met. So next slide. So why are we falling short? We've discussed some of the issues. We have obviously some federal actions that were unanticipated, but then we also see just that the state needs to procure significantly more electricity. There's about half of what we need currently from the state procurements. And likely the state will need to meet the needs. The state will likely need to expand the amount of public renewables built from about 3 gigawatts, which is planned, to maybe 4 or 5 times that per multiple analyses from outside groups. Also, rising electrification is going to affect how quickly we can meet that 70% target, because it is a percent. As the amount of electricity grows, that we need to consume, we're going to need to create more to meet that 70% goal. We're seeing that as vehicles are electrified, buildings, and industry. Which is good news in that it's electrified, but it means we need to create significantly more sources. And then just overall, the build out of renewables has been slower. We need to see much faster deployment. Things that have slowed it down include supply chain costs, rising inflation, tariffs now. Obviously, projects have been canceled because of these factors. There's been significant upgrades to the grid that need to happen. And it's necessary that in order to transition to electricity, especially in rural areas, we're going to need to invest in the grids to be able to do that. And then we'll note that recent changes through the RAPID Act that was passed last year, which created the Office of Siting and Permitting, has already seen some real benefits in terms of the time it has taken for projects to be approved, cutting them nearly by 2/3. So from 3.5 years as the average approval timeline is now looking at 1.2 years. So that has been good news in terms of the build out. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Bethany, who can explain more of our findings about where and how renewables are being built in the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. Let's take a look at New York State solar projects on the next slide. Shown here are all of New York State's installations reported last summer, grouped by zip codes and aggregated by total capacity, based on data from NYS and S&P Global Market Intelligence. This represents more than 230,000 panel installations, totaling more than 5,000 megawatts of capacity, including large and small scale systems. Each bubble represents a group of zip codes with light to dark scale representing the number of installations in a given area, and size representing total capacity. The majority of the state's existing solar projects are small-scale distributed units, with downstate New York consisting of nearly half of all distributed power and 82% of physical panel installations. New York City in particular has 58,000 installations and 465 megawatts. Upstate New York has a majority of utility-scale solar installations and more than half of the state's aggregate solar power. Most of these larger scale projects are deployed in western and central regions of New York. And we also see these trends continuing into the future when we take a look at the planned project pipeline on the next slide. So last summer, New York hit a record of 10 gigawatts of planned solar projects over 216 locations. These are reported to be in commercial operation no later than 2030 and contribute 12% to the state's renewable electricity needs. Most large-scale solar projects are, again, located in western and central New York, with some smaller-scale utility projects concentrated in the capital region. New York could also see 2.5 gigawatts of onshore wind online before 2030. These could contribute 3% to the state's renewable electricity needs, and the majority of planned onshore wind projects will be located in western New York. These projects are not guaranteed to come online. Only a third of the onshore wind power is actually under construction and in advanced development. And there's only 10% of the planned solar projects that are actively under construction or nearing completion. The remaining 90% of those solar projects could be at risk of delays or cancellations depending on the market conditions and the regulatory environment. With all that in mind, what does this actually mean for workers? My colleague Iris Packman will discuss challenges and opportunities facing the clean energy workforce on the next slide.
Thank you, Bethany. So as we look at the possibility for creating potentially hundreds of thousands of clean energy jobs in New York State, it's important to look at what information do we have already about these jobs. Next slide. We know that the clean energy industry is booming. It's outpacing the state's employment growth overall. According to NYSERDA's latest clean energy industry report, clean energy jobs grew 5% in the past year, more than twice as fast as the overall jobs in the state. And by some estimates, by 2030, New York could double 2019 levels of solar employment. And there are some really strong labor standards that labor has fought for and achieved on these larger scale projects in New York State, such as project labor agreements and labor peace agreements for offshore wind procurements, as well as prevailing wage requirements on larger scale, utility scale solar projects. So as Bethany noted, we're seeing that a lot of these jobs are, especially the newer jobs, are coming in upstate New York. And we are also finding, according to our study from last year, that many of the workers are transient. They travel around the country to follow the projects. So although we're seeing jobs being created in New York State, they are not necessarily local jobs. We found that 65% of the workers we surveyed relocated to New York for a job site. So that's something to keep in mind when we think about these numbers. We've also seen that reporting has shown that job growth in the renewables has not necessarily been distributed equitably. For example, women make up 48% of New York's workforce, but reportedly 26% of clean energy jobs. Similarly, Black workers make up 14% of New York's workforce, but only 9% of clean energy jobs. And in our 2024 study of solar workers in New York, we found that Black and Hispanic workers reported earning just over half the salary that white workers earned. They were also less likely to receive benefits or the protections of a year-round position and salary. So these are just some of the things to consider when we think about how these jobs are actually affecting communities within the state. We also have some reporting from NYSERDA that most of the disadvantaged communities, which is the term of art, have a lower share of clean energy workers living within them than in other parts of the state. But most recently in 2024, NYSERDA did report that 31% of clean energy jobs are in disadvantaged communities, and disadvantaged communities make up 35% of the population, so presumably reaching some closer level of parity. Some parts of the state saw larger growth in clean energy jobs in these disadvantaged communities, including in Western New York and in Long Island. And the other concern that we have when we think about these jobs being created is how strong are the jobs, how high quality are these safe jobs that pay a livable wage, a salary that you can support a family on. And one of the things that we look at for that metric is unionization rates. In utility scale, the larger scale projects, unionization rates are much higher. However, in the smaller scale distributed solar, we see very, very few union positions, and this has led to precarious working conditions that we've seen. Specifically, most of the projects under 1 megawatt are non-union. Majority, 58% workers that we surveyed last year reported lacking health and retirement benefits in that industry. So this is more of a precarious work model, not something that we want to point to as ideal for the rest of the industry when we think about creating high quality jobs. So what we can look to is broadening labor protections for renewable energy workers who are not currently covered, such as in the smaller scale distributed projects, energy storage, and adjacent industries. Next slide, please. So we do also see some other opportunities to create these high quality clean energy jobs, right? When we're talking about this potential for hundreds of thousands of new jobs, let's look at how we can really invest in our communities. And so the investments that the state can make to attract in-state residents, especially to help with training for workers who have been underrepresented in the clean energy industry, that can help New York kind of flip the narrative about whether we have a worker shortage versus a good jobs shortage. We also think prioritizing larger scale projects will be important to fulfill the larger energy gap in the grid, but also to bring in the projects that have those stronger labor standards, which includes a prevailing wage rate, as well as, depending on the type of project, project labor agreements or labor peace agreements. And then the last thing that we would recommend is looking at building out more publicly owned projects. So projects built by NYPA, the New York Public Power Authority, are required to have project labor agreements and also have apprenticeship requirements. Currently, NYPA is only planning 2.8 gigawatts of clean energy generation projects. This is primarily utility and distributed solar, but these will be union jobs, which is a huge benefit for local communities, including projects helping ensure projects are completed on time, on budget, with well-trained staff who can perform the work safely. We also need to do more research. We need more reporting on solar and wind energy jobs so we can track the wages, benefits, and working conditions as these industries evolve and develop over time. And just wanted to flag the last thing that coming up for Climate Week in September, we're going to have a forthcoming report called Key Interventions for New York State that will dig into some of the top 10 initiatives that the state can take to help meet its climate, clean energy, and labor goals. So with that, thank you. And I'm going to turn it to Lynda to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany and Iris, for walking us through your findings. There is so much to discuss. But before we do that, I'd like to pass the mic over to Senator Harckham of Senate District 40, who chairs the Senate Environmental Conservation Committee. He will share a few remarks. Senator?
Hi, Lynda. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I want to thank everybody at Cornell for all the work you do. I want to thank you for this webinar today. I want to thank all the panelists, everybody who's attending. My job is really to say thank you for all your efforts to everyone. Part of the promise of the clean energy revolution is not just a better planet, but it's better working conditions. It's good paying union jobs. That is the promise of the clean energy revolution. And, we are making progress, but we have a lot more work to do. That's why it is so frustrating that the governor put Cap and Invest on hold. We're looking at a minimum of $3 billion a year in investment, but actually it could be as high as $10 billion investment. And when we passed Climate Action Fund 2 years ago, we wrote very stringent labor standards into those community-centered projects so that there would be project labor agreements, that there would be apprenticeship, that there would be local hiring. And these were supposed to be local projects sourced by the community. And that's the promise of the clean energy revolution, is building robust, sustainable communities with good paying, sustaining jobs. We're working on some things in the budget, some thermal network projects at places like SUNY. That will be helpful in the lower Hudson Valley, where our building trades are still hurting after the closure of Indian Point. If we can get one of these thermal network projects at SUNY purchased, that will be helpful to them. And this is what we're talking about, getting those demonstration projects off the ground. But what you've been talking about today, getting these larger projects done all over the state. Also disappointing, in addition to not doing Cap Invest, that PSC seems to be walking away from community solar and smaller scale solar. We need to be building solar every place the sun shines. We need to be putting up wind turbines every place the wind blows. We have so much work to do. We have so much opportunity, both for the environment and for our workforce and for our communities. So I want to thank you all once again for everything you're doing. Thanks for having me. I'm going to run back to session now. But thank you. Be well, everyone.
Thank you, Senator, for your remarks and for being here. We appreciate you. Okay, I think that serves as a really great grounding. Vice Senator, for our panel discussion, I just want to do a gentle reminder for folks to submit your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A chat box below so we can get to them at the panelists. Joining Bethany and Iris, we have New York Assemblymember Michaelle Solages of Assembly District 22, chairs the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus. Joining her, we also have Julie Tai, President of the New York League of Conservation Voters. And rounding out our bench, we have Vincent Albanese, Executive Director of the New York State Laborers Political Action Committee. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so there's been a lot of information that we've been getting at the start of this webinar. I want to start off our discussion with some table setting. And Julie, I'll start with you. Can you break down the role renewable energy plays in New York's energy landscape? Why is this conversation today so important?
Sure, thank you. And first, congratulations on your report. I'm delighted to see that. Always good to have more and better information out there. I'm gonna talk about this from two different perspectives. Like, one is right now, the upstate grid is predominantly zero emission, right? And the downstate grid is predominantly fossil fuel. So about 90% of the energy we're getting downstate is from fossil fuel. And the reason why there's a challenge with that is because obviously that's contributing to climate change, and that's fueling, storms. We're seeing more fires, which we don't typically see in the East. Obviously, it was devastating to see what happened to LA this year, and we're seeing more extreme heat, damaging storms, more frequent storms are what we're seeing as a result of all this climate action. And that, as you pointed out, the jobs aren't distributed equally. Neither are the impacts of climate change. So we really see those more impacts on low-income communities, communities of color, those disadvantaged communities, as Iris described, who are really adversely impacted and are not seeing benefits associated with this as of yet. And there's a public health crisis associated with that. So certainly we want to make sure that we're reducing pollution, right? People think about this as just about greenhouse gas emissions, but when you reduce your reliance on fossil fuels, you're also reducing other pollution that's out there, like particulate matter and NOx and benzene and things that cause people to have asthma, respiratory ailments, cancer, other types of illnesses. And again, those impacts are not distributed equally either. And as we're thinking about transitioning, Iris kind of touched on this in her remarks, but like having a clean energy grid is foundational to how we're going to transition the economy writ large. We're working at how are we going to transition to cleaner ways of heating and cooling our buildings? How are we going to move to cleaner ways of moving people around, people and goods around in transportation? And how are we going to clean manufacturing so that we are still getting all the goods and services that we need in a way that has less pollution associated with? So it's really the foundation of how we're going to achieve this transition in our economy.
Thanks, Julie. And, for folks who might be unfamiliar with this issue, could you talk about what happens if we can't meet our goals? Like, what's at stake here?
So first of all, people are dying prematurely because of the health impacts of air pollution writ large. We are certainly going to continue to experience more extreme storms, more fires, more extreme heat. We're seeing that pretty frequently. And that, we've seen that the top 10 hottest years are within the last 10 or 12 years, right? And that's not by accident. So we're going to continue to see that happen, which could result in sea level rise, which then puts more property at risk and people's lives at risk as a result of that. And ultimately, we want to see more jobs, but I think Vinny will talk more about that.
Thanks, Julie. I think it's helpful framing for us to go into the discussion with that. So before we jump into some of the major themes Iris and Bethany highlighted in their presentation, I want to take a moment to reflect on where we are right now, and what we've accomplished thus far. And as part of that table setting, I'd like to ask everyone on the panel this question. What are some of our successes? What has New York gotten right when it comes to renewable energy development? Iris, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, I think as we've discussed, the labor standards that labor and allies have fought really hard for and won in multiple layers of the law are really exceptional, right? We also have very ambitious climate goals and kind of helped set the stage for the country of what New York is hoping to accomplish. So I think there's a lot of successes there. We've also seen distributed, built out successfully. However, that is a small fraction of what we ultimately will need. So I would point to those as some of our major successes.
Thanks, Iris. Bethany, do you want to share?
Of course, thank you. I think some of our successes have included the numerous solicitations that the state is having for renewable energy projects. Of course, the strong labor standards that we have on the offshore wind projects is significant. There's a lot of headway, like Iris mentioned, about distributed scale buildouts. That includes rooftop and even community scale projects. So I think on that regard, we're doing great, but we're definitely doing more. We need more work to be done in actually procuring projects, especially in light of the delays facing a lot of the offshore wind industry on the market level and the permitting level. I'll pass it over.
Julie, you can take it next, and we'll go to the assembly member and then to Vinny.
Okay, I'm hoping not to steal the Assemblyman's thunder, but I think some of the things that we've done is pass some good laws. that will help to streamline the challenges, right? So I think about, like, everyone talks about the Climate Act that was passed in 2019. Well, in 2020, the state passed the Accelerated Renewable Energy and Community Benefits Act, which is quite a mouthful. And that's what set up having more streamlined permitting for siting of renewable energy. And then last year, you alluded to this in your remarks, because as I always say, there is no transition without transmission. We passed the Rapid Act to help streamline how we're doing on transmission projects, because those also take a very long time. Right now, actually, what's a win, even though it's in progress still, is that the NYSO is using a procedure called Public Policy Transmission Need, or PPTN, and they have identified a project that is now starting to be, they're working on the details of it, but they've announced a project called Propel New York that will connect the grid between Long Island, New York City, and upstate through Westchester. And that's going to be something that will help to make our grid more resilient and to help move energy both upstate and downstate a little bit better. And of course, they're doing that with union labor to help make that happen. I've been to South Fork myself, which is the first offshore wind project, the first commercial offshore wind project in the entire country. And that's pretty awesome. And it's overperforming. Like that, to me, is a huge celebration and something that we need to point to as we're thinking about how are we going to get more offshore wind. So, and obviously I agree on distributed solar. It's nice to meet a goal ahead of time. So I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Assemblymember?
Julie, you could steal my thunder any day. So, and I just appreciate Cornell for always organizing us and galvanizing us. And for me, it's really basic. New York didn't just talk big about climate; it actually put pen to paper, which in government is always necessary because people will talk, but they won't put action behind it. And so we have really legally binding emission targets in the best in the nation. So we are behind, but at least we have a guiding document. And so, it's great that we're hitting our distributed solar goals ahead of schedule. Julie mentioned Sunrise Wind, which, being from Long Island, I'm so proud of because we're powering so many homes and creating good construction jobs. And additionally, for myself, New York has really prioritized environmental justice. We're directing at least 65% of climate and clean energy programs to benefit disadvantaged communities. So those who've been harmed most by the climate crisis and extreme weather events, landfills and such are now prioritized in this conversation. So it really brings equity and inclusiveness to this conversation. And a little other nuanced programs that we've done within the legislature wrapped around labor and jobs is that we instituted a Timbuktu Climate Workforce Initiative, where young people from downstate are traveling throughout the state and especially up in the Adirondacks, and not only interacting with nature, but interacting with climate professionals, people in the jobs, the clean energy jobs, and they're learning about these jobs. They're like, no more talking about whether they want to be a YouTube star, a basketball player, or a doctor, lawyer, engineer, like my parents said to me, being Caribbean. Like they can actually get into these new jobs of the future. And so making sure that we start young and having these conversations with high schoolers is really going to ensure that our future, although bleak right now, in the future will be bright. So I think we've done a lot of great things. We should be proud of ourselves, and nothing good is easy. There's always a struggle.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Vinny, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I mean, I think a few of the things I was going to say specifically about the labor standards and some of the permitting reforms have already been touched on. On the labor standard piece, what we're really talking about here is pretty significant. We're one of the only states that has this. It's anything over 1 megawatt in generation, in renewable generation, is prevailing wage. And so it's, we hear labor standards, but that's really what that is. And that's very, very significant for both union and non-unionized labor working on these projects. I would say another component of that, we actually have a bill moving forward in the Assembly and the Senate right now that mimics the apprenticeship requirements, which I'm sure later in this conversation, we might get into some of the importance of apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship in this space. But you know, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the apprenticeship language that's in that bill has been incredibly significant in creating good careers in a place like New York that does have, you know, a large amount of generation that taking place where people are benefiting from those or developers are benefiting from those tax credits. So you know, it's important. I'm sure we'll probably get into what do we still need to do type question. I have a long list of things there, but you know, this is the type of thing where even in a state like New York, some of the things that are going right are because of the federal government, because of the IRA in particular. And you know, obviously that's very problematic when we look at, you know, the current leadership in Washington and what may happen to that. But those are things as well that have created some very positive developments, at least for workers in this space in New York.
Thanks, everyone. I'm loving all the shout outs and I'm loving all of that. We're going to get to it. We have a really great crew here and that makes me feel good. You know, I think it's just helpful to identify our successes to really pinpoint where our gaps are. I think, you know, let's dig into some of the challenges that Bethany and Iris raised in the presentation, and we'll start with deployment. Bethany, you mentioned that our current pace of renewable energy build out and procurement is falling short of our near-term goals. Can you walk us through why you think that is?
Thank you, Lynda. There's several factors at play as to why we're falling behind these targets. For one, the market conditions for the industry have changed significantly since New York State had set those mandates for renewables, especially for offshore wind projects. Post-pandemic inflation and supply chain disruptions have made projects more expensive than originally planned. So, for instance, developers that had signed contracts at a fixed rate ended up having to either renegotiate or cancel their projects and fall under a new solicitation, such as the new solicitations that were issued for Empire Wind and Sunrise Wind because of those inflation and other cost impacts. Another factor that's hindering the pace that we can get to these targets is the fact that, as discussed, there is rising electrification in the industry, as well as industry growth from high energy demand sectors such as AI data centers, electric vehicles, heat pumps. All of these new technologies are consuming more energy, which means that we need to be building more renewables than expected. And all of these projections for energy are much higher than what was anticipated at the time of creating these targets. So these targets are reflective of a period of time where we weren't aware of the higher energy demands that we would be expecting for later years. And of course, there has been progress as discussed on the state permitting for projects, but historically, before those reforms in 2021, there was a much longer time period for getting these projects off the ground. And right now we're in a regulatory environment, at least on the federal level, where certain projects like offshore wind permitting are getting more difficult. And of course, other factors at play with environmental permits from the federal government for certain projects. But those are a few of my points. I'll pass it over.
Okay, it sounds like a big mix of things. Assemblymember, I'd like to take it to you next. You're championing policies that create a more equitable and sustainable environment for all New Yorkers. Can you talk about some of your legislative priorities and how they can address some of the challenges Bethany just laid out?
Yeah, definitely. As chair of the New York State Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus, it's an organization within the legislature comprised of 80 members out of 213. So we, try to throw our weight around to ensure that our communities, the communities that are most harmed, benefit in the halls of Albany. And so our legislative priority is always centered around justice. So whether it's, criminal justice or environmental justice, we want to make sure that we have an affordable and a just transition for our communities. And typically in the early part of, or the late part of the year, we do a solicitation from individuals, anyone, including those on a screen, to our legislative agenda, which we call the People's Budget. So this year we had a really bold climate agenda. And it's not only about meeting our renewable energy goals, but also uplifting our communities. So we've pushed for build public renewables because we want to advocate for a full funding of the BPRA and enable NYPA to really develop publicly owned renewable energy projects and phase out these, fossil fuel plants that primarily sit in our community. We've also pushed the executive on the 15 gigawatts of public renewable energy by 2030. We sent a love letter to the governor and also to the NYPA board of trustees, urging them to commit to 15 gigawatts. And it's important because we want to make sure we're reducing the energy cost burden on our communities and reinvesting that revenue in renewable projects. I mentioned the Timbuktu Climate Workforce Pipeline that we're always continually pushing and working with SUNY so that kids can be educated on the future jobs. We're also pushing the Just Energy Transition Act, which ensures that there's responsible retirement of these fossil fuel facilities that keep coming back to life. And people keep saying, oh, we can't get rid of them. We can. We just need to be bold. And, I just want to make sure that we also, talk about the growing narrative that clean energy is to blame for rising utility costs. And I just want to say it's not true. And if we look at it, what's really driving the unaffordability is a continued investment of outdated, expensive fossil fuel infrastructure. And so we're literally using ratepayer money to expand gas pipelines, and we refuse to retire them. And so as a caucus, we're pushing initiatives. Although they may be bold, we will continue pushing them because we need to make sure we can make things affordable by having caps on utility bills and pushing bills like the New York Heat Act, but also making sure that we invest into long-term affordability programs and healthier communities. So the caucus is really at the forefront of this. We're willing to put all our political capital on this, and we're always looking for allies.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Julie, I have, a similar question for you. The New York League of Conservation Voters does research and advocacy on environmental protection issues in New York, and I'm curious what your organization is seeing, technical solutions to these types of deployment challenges we're facing right now.
So one is we're actually trying to engage communities more because we know that people come out to say no to things. They don't often come out to say yes to things. And so we're trying to help mobilize more people because we know that people really are out there, because one of the challenges that we are seeing with some of these energy projects is local opposition. And so it's trying to make sure people are educated and engaged on these issues and have the opportunity to have questions answered, but also to engage positively, which I do think we need more of. Certainly, there have been some challenges. Obviously, the federal government has decided there's an energy emergency, but apparently that doesn't include renewables, which makes absolutely no sense when about 94% of the utility scale energy that came online last year was from clean energy. So that's certainly something that we need to address. And I think we need to think about creative technologies. We're starting to see thermal networks as part of the solution. Or how are we going to transition away from gas to a cleaner way of heating and cooling our buildings? And a thermal energy network, which could be using geothermal, it could use, water, it could use sewage, which has this, and it sounds funny, but there's heat in the sewage that you can capture and repurpose. My favorite story is perhaps that the mail sorting facility south of Penn Station, which is 2 full city blocks, actually generates about 8 megawatts of waste heat a year, which right now is just discharged into the environment. They can capture that and instead connect it with an apartment building for heating, cooling, and hot water. So really trying to figure out new technology on that front. I do want to point out that people always talk about supply chain impacts and how costs are going up. That's not specific to clean energy or energy, right? That's any infrastructure project right now. And so we should stop pointing that as as a concern that's that makes it sound like it's unique to the clean energy industry when it's not. It's every project that requires any kind of thing. If you want to build a new pipeline, right? Or maybe that's not a great example, but if you want to build a new transformer, you have to have ordered it already for 3 years ago, because there is that much of a supply chain challenge. So there are a lot of supply opportunities out there to help build a clean energy economy, and it's impacting everybody.
Thanks, Julie. I think, the undercurrent to our conversation is really about how we're taking care of our communities. And that also means thinking about the impacts these renewable energy projects have on environmental justice communities and disadvantaged communities. Assemblymember, you spoke a little bit about protecting EJ folks, folks that live in impacted communities. Are there ways energy policies can go further to protect environmental justice in disadvantaged communities?
Yes, and we must. And I really have to say that the report makes it clear. I love the report. So if you haven't downloaded it, go out and download it. But it makes it clear that we're falling behind our clean energy goals and that the jobs growth in the sector is not being distributed equally. And many renewable energy jobs are low wage and lack union protections and are concentrated away from communities most impacted. So we can go a step further. We can mandate strong labor standards. We can direct investment into disadvantaged communities. We can support public renewables, taxpayer dollars investing into it. And we can ensure that we have community ownership and input, because it's not just about consultation, it's about making sure that the frontline communities are shaping the conversation and not just being hosts, but being a part of this beautiful coalition. And so, we can really invest into this. It just takes some, work, and it takes some, as I said before, political will and engagement. And I think that we really can have a true climate leadership path that centers people and really takes away the burdens from our communities.
Thank you, Assemblymember. And I think, you touched on the labor piece here, and that's a really good reminder that climate action is also a labor issue. And Iris and Bethany's presentation did share a bit about how renewable energy development impacts New York's workforce. Vinny, I would love for you to talk to us about what your members are already doing around renewable energy. What does that work look like?
So, I mean, specifically on the type of work, when you talk about generation, you kind of run the gamut from, rooftop type solar installations, right? So, some of the smaller distributed stuff. But when you look at some of the big grid scale stuff, we're talking about, really, these are heavy civil projects, right? Not dissimilar, there's land grading that has to be done, all sorts of tree pruning and other site work that has to be done. There's the actual installation of the racking systems and the screws that hold these solar panels. In the case of wind, there are large concrete pads that are often poured in order for the turbines to be installed upon. So it runs the gamut. One thing about the labor is, everyone knows what a carpenter is or an electrician. Sometimes people think that I work for the New York State Department of Labor because we're the New York State laborers. But no, we are often, at least us specifically, we always say we're usually the first trade on the jobs, on pretty much any job, and the last trade to leave. And we do have a role in pretty much every facet of construction, specifically when it comes to the renewable stuff.
Thank you, Vinny. It's always helpful to kind of visualize the full ecosystem that's doing all of this work. Iris, I'll take it to you. Your research found that there are no prevailing wage requirements for distributed solar projects, and the industry is actually almost universally non-union. Why is this so important? What is the significance of this finding?
Thanks, Lynda. And just to clarify, when we're talking about distributed, we're talking about projects under 1 megawatt. I realize that there are slightly different sometimes definitions used, so to be clear. And so there we're talking about the smaller scale projects, which are often those sort of rooftop or neighborhood projects. And because they make up about 41% of the state's planned and built capacity, it's not an insignificant portion. And if you obviously expand it to the 5 megawatts, you have more, but those do have some labor standards. And what we found, what the research has shown for decades, is that when you have unionization and union density, you see significant economic benefits. So, and it has a spillover effect within that industry. So we're talking about direct wages, but also spillover wage effects for similar occupations and industries, reduced poverty rates for union households, non-union households, health insurance, life insurance, paid leave, pension. I mean, all the things that kind of create this as a high quality career that someone can raise their family on, right? And live on and retire on. And so much of the poor job quality that our research has shown and precarious nature of the distributed solar work, that smaller scale work, can be explained by the relatively low union density in the industry. So in New York overall, 1 in 8, about 12% of clean energy workers belongs to a union. But when we're talking about utility workers, it's about 19%. So it is below sort of the utility industry average in New York State. And so that just with that decline in density too that we've seen overall, that has affected the overall increase in inequality as well as the depression of wages. And that also exacerbates the racial wage gap as well. So when union density drops, we see that racial wage gap expanded as well. So there's just a lot of factors that help keep things down. And then also when we talk about prevailing wage, what we mean is basically a union average sort of wage. And so when you have folks who have to be paid that rate, it means that non-union companies are not outbidding union companies, right? And so it levels the playing field so that all workers are going to be getting paid this prevailing wage rate, which includes a rate for wages, but also a rate for benefits. And so that is really going to affect people's quality of life who are working on these jobs.
Thanks, Iris. Vinny, we hear all the time that New York just doesn't have enough workers to, make meaningful progress towards renewable energy. But Bethany's and Iris research actually finds that what we're experiencing is a good jobs shortage. Could you define what a good jobs shortage is and the effects it has on Black and women workers and workers from impacted communities?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parts to that question. I'll try and go through it quickly, but yeah, we're constantly hear this. There's a worker shortage. There's a worker shortage. We don't necessarily see that. I think one of the major challenges here, and the assembly member kind of touched on this before, when we talk about disadvantaged communities or individuals that never had opportunities to good union union job opportunities like the ones that we envision and hope for and do see some of in the renewable industry. One of the major challenges is when you look at generation and you look at where it has to take place, at least on grid scale, right? When we look at the large projects, they are often in the most rural and least densely populated areas of the state for good reason, right? You can't put, in Southeast Queens, you can't put a 300 megawatt solar farm. You just can't do it, right? There's no space. So one of the challenges that we found, and we've done a lot of work on this, we've actually been given some money in last year's budget, and again in this year's budget as well, hopefully, to provide wraparound services to individuals that are in, let's say, Binghamton, Rochester, the Capital Region, Buffalo, Syracuse, where there is this massive amount of workforce that is available that wants to work on these projects. But often these projects are an hour and a half away, 2 hours away. And we would go into these communities, high schools, whatever, we'd work with community groups. And they'd say, look, we'd love to work on these jobs, but I don't have childcare that's going to be able to facilitate for me to, now I have an hour and a half commute to work each way, or I don't have a car, or I can't take your pre-apprenticeship program that's going to be an 8 or 12 week program to then get into the apprenticeship program if I'm not going to get paid for 8 or 12 weeks. And one of the ways we've solved that is we've gotten some private grants and used money to actually just to fix these problems, to try and address it with resources, providing resources to individuals entering into the program. But also, the state, I think, has started to come around, and the Assembly's been particularly helpful on this. in understanding. Everyone talks about training and we need training and training. The unions in this state have some of the best training facilities of anywhere in the country, particularly on the trade side. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on training. We need to address the real barriers that are preventing certain people from accessing these jobs. So again, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but I do think that is the first challenge that needs to be addressed if we're going to start addressing real equity amongst who has opportunities to these jobs. We have to deal with that.
Assemblymember, I would love to hear from you also. How can we support Black and Brown communities and make sure folks are getting these jobs?
Yeah, the prior speaker said it best. It's not only giving a person a job, but also thinking about all the social determinants that exist around their life and seeing how we can take those barriers and reduce them. And so, and Julie also said it too, it's not just about like doing these projects, it's also about engaging folks, knocking on their doors, holding town halls, bringing folks into the planning. And it's going to take all of that and more. And so for our communities, it's about really making that step forward and engaging them and letting them know that if we want a just transition, we have to build it with people and not just for them.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Self-determination. Thank you, Assemblymember. Another key issue that was raised in the presentation was the federal government's attitude towards climate initiatives, specifically renewable energy. Iris, can you tell us more about how the recent federal actions can really impact New York and actually have been impacting New York?
Sure. So specifically with offshore wind, which I know is front of many folks' mind, earlier this month, the government announced a stop work order for Empire Wind, which is one of two projects that were currently under construction, and construction had already started. So that's going to obviously set the state back, not only in achieving its offshore wind goals, but its overall renewable electricity goals. And I think that, we're going to see it potentially have much longer term effects, because it's not just a pause for right now, right? And then there are all these workers who were already committed to working on these projects, who they were union workers, right? These were really good jobs. And now the communities are left high and dry. So I would say that that's a major impact immediately for the surrounding areas. And it also is obviously going to therefore slow our achievement of our emissions goals as well.
Thank you, Iris. Vinny, do you want to share a little bit about how federal action is impacting workers stateside at all here?
Yeah, I alluded to it before. I think one of the most obvious things is, the IRA, at least for the moment, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides not just funding for many of these projects or tax benefits for these projects to make them viable. Many of them won't be viable otherwise. And to Iris's point that, there's a lot of, when these projects go under, there's a lot of promises that don't get to be kept. And that creates a lot of bad will in communities and makes our challenge just that much harder every time. And we just lose trust. And, but on the federal side, I think even if the IRA were to stay in place, I don't think any of us are delusional enough to think that this administration, given what they've already done, that the Department of Labor and the Treasury Department are going to enforce these labor standards, from their side, right? So if that's not going to happen, having apprenticeship requirements in place at a federal level, even if they were to stay in place, which I do not expect they will. I do expect that when they do pass a budget, that many of these protections will be stripped, if not the entire IRA program. But we're just very aware that there's not going to be enforcement, even if it is theoretically still kept on the books, in law. And the real challenge there is like, if the law is not going to be enforced, it doesn't really matter if it's in place. And I hate to say this, but developers will know that, right? And that will influence the way that they say, you know what, we don't need to work with you know, a bona fide apprenticeship program on this project, because quite frankly, no one's gonna enforce it. And so those things we are already seeing, unfortunately, in conversations with some, and I would say it's few, at least on the grid scale side. You know, there really are a lot of well-intentioned and good developers still in this state, but we're already seeing this kind of creep into those discussions, where the importance of apprenticeship programs, prevailing wage, and the contractors that they use, seems like, you know, there's a tacit recognition that they're not going to be enforced, and that's a real problem.
Thanks, Vinny. Assemblymember, I guess, given all of this, what are the steps New York can take to meet our 2030 and 2040 energy targets?
I just want to make sure we hone in on the fact that New York is going to need to be bold. And, the federal government is turning its back, and we cannot follow their trend. Unfortunately, we see it already, and it's upsetting. And I know that, as we are going through our budget process, I am going to keep pushing back against any further cuts. But we have to really get serious on our climate goals and not rely on solely private markets to get us there. That approach isn't fast enough, and it's not reaching the communities that are most important. So we really need to embrace public power. We have to establish a public renewable energy authority with its ability to, build its own and incorporate clean energy infrastructure. We need to make sure that we have green bank financing, so that local governments and public housing authorities like NYCHA can upgrade their infrastructure and not pass that cost on to residents. And we have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. It's really simple, but unfortunately, it's not happening. But I need all your folks to help us out. Everyone on this call, on the Zoom, can be an advocate and to help us really push our political officials on this. And it's going to take political will, because right now, folks are running around. I'm not going to name who. They're saying that our climate goals are unachievable. And yes, they're aspirational, but they are achievable if we get it done. So, we're going to need a lot of support, help, because clean energy shouldn't be a public good. Clean energy is a public good and not a private luxury. And so, we're going to need a lot of push on government. And so, I don't want to name names, but, folks on the second floor need to just have political courage and know that they're doing good things. Look at, many initiatives that are currently being fought against by the federal government that's proving its pudding, and it was widely unpopular, but now is popular. So, we can get it done. We just need courage, and we need to point to data and facts.
I laughed a little bit because, is it really a webinar if there's no call to action? I'm just kidding. So remember, I have a follow-up question for you here. Given what Vinny was saying about the IRA and just what we're learning through the presentation and this discussion, it seems like there needs to be a shift in the energy market. Private companies are not building enough to keep at the pace that we need to meet our goals. The IRAs, as Vinny highlighted earlier, which were in place, to incentivize these developments, are in jeopardy. What can New York do to take the lead and ensure that we have the public investment needed to really reach our renewable energy goals?
There's really so many dynamics that we could use. I like to point to the revenue sharing models that exist. If we make sure that disadvantaged communities are participating, we could really push forward in getting them involved. And, a lot of oversight and accountability tools. I tell people, equity scorecards, public reporting, third-party oversight that tracks who's being hired, who's benefiting, who's getting the investment. We have to have metrics, and we have to make sure that we are keeping folks accountable in that conversation. And so, it's a continual conversation, and I'm hoping that we can get it done. And I really point to my other panelists to really just hammer down that point.
Thank you, Assemblymember. And Vinny, I want to ask you a similar question. What can New York do right now to really protect our workers at this moment?
I mean, I think, when we talk about, the distributed stuff under 1 megawatt, even if it's not necessarily a prevailing wage requirement, we do understand there's complicated economics and we want to continue to see distributed get built out, but that doesn't mean there can't be much stronger wage standards, but also safety protections, just a broader enforcement of what's going on in that space, because as Bethany and Iris and as the report I'm sure goes into detail about, I mean, there are real problems there, right? I mean, it's very dangerous work. It's a tremendous amount of exploitation. Undocumented workers are getting really, really exploited in that space. And we see it. We've spoken to those workers. I do think there's one other component that New York has to do here. I mean, well, obviously a plug for our apprenticeship bill to mirror, the IRA standards in New York. That I think that would be a very good step. I also think that we need to have accurate bidding of these projects, because one of the problems is, even with prevailing wage requirements, say over 1 megawatt, when a developer underbids the project and then they come to us, as we begin to negotiate or figure out, what the workforce is going to look like, and they say, look, well, we just can't do it. I'm sorry, the numbers don't add up, and we kind of look at them like, well, the law says you have to pay prevailing wage. So when you were bidding on the project, you probably should have bid it correctly. Don't come back at us and want us to make concessions for workers when there are laws in place to protect them. So I do think, and the inaccuracy of some of the bidding, I have to say, is also part of the reason why sometimes these projects don't get built eventually anyway. And if that doesn't happen, that goes to kind of the false promises that were made to communities about the jobs that were going to be there. So I do think, even though we don't typically think that that's so associated with the impact it has on workers, it has a huge impact on workers. We have to make sure the projects are bid in accordance with what the laws are, and that are bid correctly so that they're viable projects and that they don't try and make up the difference on the back of workers. So.
Thanks, Vinny. Folks, let's go ahead and transition over to our Q&A. We've been collecting some questions from the audience the entire webinar. I want to give a nod to our panelists. Apparently, we've been answering questions proactively, so good for us. But the first question I have, and maybe I'll throw it to Iris. Iris, why should New York be prioritizing utility scale solar development specifically?
Sure. And I think we've addressed some of this as well. Our research shows that going forward, our projections, which is a figure in the report, that the distributed scale, the smaller scale solar projects, yes, they have been going at a fast pace, and yes, we have been hitting our targets, but that rate is not going to continue into the future. So we are going to see it sort of slowing down and leveling off. So we will need to fill the gaps with the larger scale projects. And then obviously, as we discussed, the larger scale projects do have those labor protections, which is more likely to ensure that these are actually going to be high quality jobs that will then benefit the communities where they're situated. So I think those are two of the reasons. And then obviously we need to start meeting these goals at a much greater scale, because we are falling so far behind, especially with the cancellation of the offshore wind projects and the pause on future permitting right now with offshore wind. We could be looking at, I think one of our models with the high electrification scenario, only 38% renewable by 2030. And so that's a very low number. That's basically half of our goal. And so we need to fill the gap. And the best way to do that is with larger scale projects.
Cyrus.
If I can just add to that, though, we need both,
Sure.
right? It's very clear, like we need it all, right? We need more distributed solar. Obviously, we're supporting a bill that would increase the goal to 20 gigawatts by 2035, and we think that's achievable and something that we should be pursuing. We're going to need ultimately more even offshore wind than we currently have, but we're going to need utility scale, and we're going to need rooftop and community solar as well. So we need all of it, and storage.
Thank you, Julie, and I'm glad you chimed in on that point. Vinny, the next question I have, I'll kick it over to you. What ways can union labor break into the distributed solar sector?
I mean, I think obviously one of the most important things is, the state either putting some sort of wage standard there, on that and prioritizing that. And I also think, there's a big cost difference, not just on the wages, but when you are skimping on kind of the safety stuff. And again, I can't emphasize enough the egregious safety stuff that goes on, particularly on rooftop solar. And those are major costs that are skimped on, that create a bigger delta between the non-union and union employers when they are not, paying for proper PPE and not prioritizing those things, not paying workers' comp. I mean, there's a million different ways that they've created this larger gap. So obviously some more enforcement, a wage standard. And look, I think on our end, I think, and this is something maybe, we could work on if the state were to prioritize those jobs. But, we have different types of agreements, right? So maybe on those agreements, maybe this is something closer to like a residential union agreement where it might not be the same wage and benefit package that you receive on a grid scale project. But maybe, it still is a family sustaining supported wage and benefit package on these things, right? So that's something on our end that hopefully, we can continue to explore. We have done it in other markets, and it's worked fairly successfully, and we are actually doing it in the solar space in other places in the country, at least in LiUNA that I speak to. So I think it's a combination of both those things that need to be done, but we really need the state to start understanding that there's a major problem in the, specifically under 1 megawatt, the way the workforce is not just being being paid, but also the way that they're being treated and some of the safety stuff. So I would say that would be the first place to start.
Thanks, Vinny. That's really helpful. So we've spent a lot of time unpacking how New York is working to meet its renewable energy goals. And, yes, there are challenges ahead, but we've also made some significant gains, and that, deserves some praise. And so thank you to everyone here for their leadership and their tireless work on this front. I'd like to close our discussion today with a final question for all of our panelists. How do we make sure renewable energy projects, whether distributed or utility scale, are implemented equitably, that workers are protected, that environmental justice communities reap the financial benefits, and that all of this happens in a way that meaningfully reduces emissions? Iris, maybe I could start with you.
Sure. And I know that all the panelists have some great ideas, so I'm excited to hear what everyone has to share. I'll just give a few points. I think, as we discussed with our research around solar specifically, we're seeing that these a lot are sort of transient workforce. And so I think ways that we can cite the jobs within the local communities, investing in the training that Vinny has talked about, right, that would actually train up local workers. So there's a cohort that can actually do the work there, and having some connection to community benefit agreements, some requirements that the developers are actually going to invest meaningfully in the communities where they are impacted. I think that, working with community leaders to identify the most meaningful ways to make those investments. And then obviously extending labor protections and labor standards to the workforce overall, and not just at the larger scale projects.
Bethany, do you want to go next?
Of course. Thank you. And I do want to add on that we, of course, need to be pursuing apprenticeships and trainings more. We need to also make sure that the energy communities, the Inflation Reduction Act identified a set of energy communities throughout each state of the US, and a lot of them target communities that need to be considered in the equitable transition of energy, as well as considering all of the other environmental justice concerns, such as areas with high pollution levels. So a lot of these locations need to be prioritized for renewable energy buildouts in order to have a just and equitable transition of energy.
Thanks, Bethany. Julie, let's kick it over to you.
One thing is the state needs to continue to do procurement, right? That we know in order to make this happen. I think the legislature could pass some tax credits that are targeted in particular for low income households. There was a proposal in the budget that would have made more solar available, more funding available for solar for people at their homes. That's one way to get at that. Those are often people who are low income are often the ones who can least afford their energy. And so this is a way to help reduce their energy costs on that front. And I think the unions, have done a pretty good job at trying to engage more people from disadvantaged communities to be part of their membership and helping them get jobs. So I think that's a really important way to continue that work, and the state needs to help lead on that front, because the more you have some mandates on that front, I think the easier it is to achieve. So making sure that we're making these investments in those communities so people can get the benefits.
Thank you, Julie. Assemblymember?
We need to streamline permitting for responsible sited renewable projects. We need to upgrade the grid and invest into solar storage and other parts of storage as well. We need to fully fund the climate law that we passed. That's really simple but effective. And also, as said before, really scale up public renewables and procurement. I mentioned this because equity can't just be done at the back end. It really has to be done on day one. And that includes funding every initiative that we're pushing for, believing in it, and seeing it through. And so when we do that, we'll implement the climate law, which will then implement that thought behind the climate law, which is making sure that disadvantaged communities, whether it's Black and Brown communities or low-income communities, are centered in this conversation. And so, it's something that really goes beyond just job creation. It's really about making sure that frontline communities are the co-designer of these projects. They're not bystanders, but they're upstanders, and that we need to incorporate this whole network. So it's sometimes I feel overwhelmed, but then other times I know that I have to work harder because it's for the greater good.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Vinny, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff here I would say has been mentioned, but I guess one thing is, when I talk about what I mentioned before about, providing workers the resources to actually address the real barriers as to why they can't have opportunities or don't get the opportunities in this space. And, rather than, sometimes I think it gets very frustrating for us because we're putting so much, into this to try and fix those problems. We should be highlighting the places where it's successful, all these examples that we have that it has worked, and then replicating that rather than just say, it's not working overall and whatever. I mean, there are these spots that are working. Like, again, the programs that we've put in place on pre-apprenticeship, for instance, and wraparound services provided to those folks that are entering the pre-apprenticeship programs. I mean, I can show you an example where the laborers have made that really successful, right? And again, just replicating those things in other parts of the state, you providing more funding for that, and not just allowing kind of the overall narrative that we're not doing enough. Let's focus on the things that are working and just keep replicating them and building on them.
Thank you, Vinny, and all of our panelists here for their thoughts, and taking mental notes of all of the programs and bills that were mentioned, just so I can kind of nerd out later. But folks, we've reached the end of today's discussion. I want to thank Senator Harckham and all of our panelists, Assemblymember Solage, Julie Tai, Vinny Albanese, Iris, and Bethany, for sharing your thoughts here and your leadership around this work. I also want to extend a special shout out to our behind the scenes crew, Gerald Kodianko, Katie Hayden, Zach Cunningham, Catherine Solis-Fonte for their support with this webinar. Also, let's not forget, I want to thank all of you who joined and logged on today. I know it's a busy time of the year, but we really appreciate you tuning in today. We hope this discussion was insightful and inspired you. And remember to check out our new report, New York's Renewable Energy Policies, Plans, and Progress, a Climate Jobs Perspective. And keep your eyes out for a follow-up report from us on the key interventions New York can make to meet its climate goals. Until then, have a great rest of your afternoon, and we hope to see you at our next Climate Jobs Institute webinar. Thank you so much.